Painting is silent poetry, and poetry is painting that speaks. How does that sound? Let's try and understand the two terms better. What does poetry do? It makes the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. And of poetry, someone said, well, it helps you run away without ever leaving home. We have more about both of them. Poetry is emotion recollected in tranquility. It lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world. When an emotion has found its thought and thought has found words, it becomes poetry. But there is another angle, as someone said. It is the lifeblood of rebellion, revolution, and the raising of consciousness. But what about painting? It is the silence of thought and the music of sight. Or another way of keeping a diary. Someone said, it is because I paint flowers so that they will never die. A painter said if I could say it in words, I would find no reason to paint. So that is an attempt at defining both poetry and painting. Painting and poetry. When we look at them, the question arises, which is older, painting or poetry? I must remind you, my dear friends, that when we talk about poetry, we are talking about maybe what we think of as written poetry. But do remember, we had long ago language as it came through in our hymns, in our war songs, maybe in our epics. And there are critics and linguists who place them at about 2500 BC. Do you realize that makes it 4,500 years ago? That is about poetry. And the oldest known epic in the world, maybe I should add, known to the Western world, is 4,500 years old. The epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia. I can't but help mention that the Vedas are supposed to be 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, though the Rig Veda itself was collected only around 1500 BCE. Then what about painting? How old is it? What is the earliest known painting? In India, we talk about the Bhimbetka caves, the cave paintings, but we also have the earliest known painting to be 51,200 years ago. You will have to calculate what that is. And that is the Indonesian cave painting where three people are sitting around a pig. Poetry and painting are, after all, two arts, and therefore their mediums are also different. Poetry uses words and painting uses color. Are they the same in terms of what they convey, what they do to us as readers, as viewers? Painting, after all, is wordless communication, and therefore there's no language. It can be the same for anyone and everyone. They say painting has a mindfulness of its own, and therefore it brings about a mental calmness, a stillness. And after all, the painter is not a responder. He's an instigator. How? Because he makes you think when you watch a painting. It's therapy for everybody, everywhere. Is that the same for painting, for poetry too? I've just talked about painting, but is that the same for poetry too? Well, What you think, after all, becomes clear when you say it. And that's what the poet is doing. He collects his thoughts and expresses them. And therefore, probably, it's precise in the vocabulary that he is able to use. Remember, the great Aristotle had talked about catharsis that poetry can bring about. I can't but help another ancient thinker, Longinus, who talked about the ability of poetry to elevate the reader. Poetry is a kind of literature, is a form of literature. But under poetry too, we have quite a variety. There can be an elegy, a sonnet, a ballad, a limerick, haiku, ode, epic, oh yes, and many, many more. Remember the song and the madrigal. So too with poetry. So too with painting. There are various schools of painting. Some of them you may be familiar with. Some of them may be quite new. Can I list a few for you? Abstract, naturalistic, modern, surrealistic, cubism, baroque, impressionism, dadaism, and many more. I don't have a full list for you. You'll have to look for somewhere on your own. When I look at a painting, what happens to me as a viewer? Well, it's all there in front of me. Is there only one meaning? Why would people still flock to see the Mona Lisa if it was true? The same when I look at a painting which conveys ever so much. What happens? Yes, my mind races with it. And when I come to poetry, I can still read Shakespeare. I can still find a new interpretation. And then when there is imagery, as in so many plays and poems down the ages, when I read a poem with so much of imagery, what do? Well, I can shut my eyes and see it all in my mind's eye. Well, painting is becoming poetry, and poetry is becoming painting. That's how the arts merge, don't they? Painting and poetry. That means there are painters and poets. Do we have painters who are poets and poets who are painters? Well, our research showed us that we do have quite a few. Have you heard of Lewis Carroll, Dorothea Tanning, Emily Carr, Leonora Carrington, Khalil Gibran, and a little surprise for you, because I am going to deal with 3 very important poet-painters, painter-poets. Art thou abroad on the stormy night, on thy journey of love, my friend? The sky groans like one in despair. By what dim shore of the ink-black river, by what far edge of the frowning forest, through what mazy depth of gloom art thou, thy course to come to me, my friend? Oh yes, those were lines from the poem, My Friend, by Rabindranath Tagore. He doesn't need an introduction to any Indian, certainly not to lovers of poetry. Why only poetry? After all, he was a painter. He was a singer, a lyricist, a short story writer, a dramatist, a much more, a revolutionary, a freedom fighter. I could go on and on. But here, I'm going to look at him as a poet-painter. I'm calling him a poet-painter because remember, he began writing poetry at the age of 16. And painting? He began painting when he was in his 60s. when he believed that I'm not able to say all that I want to say in my writings. Strange, isn't it, for somebody who wrote so much? And can you imagine, my dear friends, he suffered from something called protanopia, and that is color blindness, where you cannot see red. You know, such people don't get driving licenses because they cannot see the difference between green and red. Anyway, that's another story. But Tagore began painting at the age of 60 plus. And what did he paint? You know, he began with doodles. He began with writing something and then cutting it out. And many people suggest that many of his paintings cannot even be called paintings. But remember, he is considered a very important poet of Indian modernism. He took his paintings for exhibitions across Europe. It was a very individualistic kind of style. And Tagore was not a poet-painter in the sense that he did not paint on his poems. His paintings are all untitled. There are scribblings and erasures. There are many zoomorphic forms. What does that mean? A combination of human and animals. Let me quote what Mulkraj Anand said about Tagore as a painter. About his paintings, he said, "Their gentle eyes and melancholy faces, pain has ceased, but the pathos lingers." That is Tagore, the poet-painter. Tiger, tiger burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? By the stream and over the mead, gave thee clothing of delight, softer clothing, woolly bright. Yes, two most famous poems of William Blake. William Blake, 1757 to 1827, probably didn't really get the credit, the popularity that he deserved. Can you imagine? He learned to be an engraver, but most of us today, particularly students of literature, know him more as a poet. He worked in illuminating, painting, merging his poetry with intricate illustrations. Remember, we just talked about Tagore, who painted, but his paintings had nothing to do with poetry, his poetry. But not so Blake. Many a time he was invited to paint, to engrave for the works of other poets. And that led him to paint, to engrave for his own books of poetry too. Blake says that he used to have visions, especially when his brother died of TB. He says that he could see his soul rise up, and that becomes one of his engravings. He says, "I am under the direction of messengers from heaven daily." Interestingly, he painted in oil but used the watercolor brushes. So he was constantly experimenting, but he was really a poet-painter because his paintings were related to his poems. His wife is once supposed to have said, and I love this, "I hardly have his company. He's always in paradise," because he was painting all those images of the heavenly creatures. He got a number of commissions to paint. He had exhibitions of his engravings, but unfortunately, he was very often criticized for the work that he had done. One of his very, very important paintings, engravings in fact, is what he did of the Canterbury Tales. So when I think of Blake as a poet-painter, here is someone who could integrate his painting with his poetry. His songs of innocence, remember, he wrote two sets, Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. His Songs of Innocence had 19 poems, but imagine they had 26 prints. And all those poems, after all, had myths also. As an engraver for many of his books, and sometimes as copies too, he did paint. Isn't it sad that this great painter-poet could not afford to buy canvases, and therefore even his oil paintings were done on ordinary paper? Because remember, paper was cheaper than oil canvas that you required for oil painting. So we are looking at this great poet who was a great engraver. And he used different medium. For example, he used to polish copper plates, I believe, and then grind the ink and then use them. Quite a variety he has left behind for us. Amazing poet, painter, engraver. That was William Blake. The blessed damsel leaned out from the gold bar of heaven. Her blue grave eyes were deeper much than a deep water even. She had 3 lilies in her hand, and the stars in her hair were 7. Her robe ungirt from clasp to hem, no wrought flowers did adorn, but a white rose of Mary's gift on her neck meekly worn, and her hair lying down her back was yellow like ripe corn. Who else could write these verses except Gabriel Charles Dante Rossetti, better known as Gabriel Dante Rossetti? Remember, he had a sister too, who also wrote poetry. Rossetti's dates are 1828 to 1882, and he founded what is called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Raphael was a poet much earlier. And these poets, this group of poets, wanted to go back to the kind of painting that was popular before Raphael. And therefore, in these poems, you find descriptions where almost every strand of hair can be seen. I just mentioned to you, his sister too was a poet, and it is her goblin market to which he first did some paintings. Actually, he was impressed, I believe, by Hunt's painting of Keats's Eve of St. Agnes. You remember that beautiful poem? What a poem! What description Keats brings to us in the Eve of St. Agnes. Well, when Rossetti saw that painting of Hunt, he was so impressed, I believe, that he decided he must do the same. What is the technique that he used? It was a combination of oil and water, of pen and ink. In fact, he is supposed to be the greatest collaborator as far as combining poetry and painting is concerned. Remember, I mentioned Raphael, the great painter of the 15th century. Each of his poems is paired with a painting. You know, that's what makes him so different. He wanted to be a poet, but he was a painter. And some people say, no, he wanted to be a painter and he became a poet. Each one of his paintings is worth looking at. And I sometimes feel if I shut my eyes and read his poems, maybe it is those same paintings that will come to my mind. So here is D.G. Rossetti, a really great painter-poet. Can I conclude this interesting episode with a new word? Ekphrasis. Ekphrasis. You know what that means? It means writing about painting. A poem about a painting. Would you like to do that? Wouldn't that be a new hobby for many of us?